Welcome to Upside, where we dig into the real stories behind the headlines affecting European venture.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
Today it's Mads and myself from SuperSeed with Andrew from 7%. And today we have Karin Nielsen, a founder, operator and product ninja with a penchant for lickable apps and devising GTM strategies with very spicy venture-backed founders. Welcome one and all. What has been on your minds this week? Karin, maybe you can kick off with how your week's been. What's new with you? What's the good, the bad, the ugly?
Yeah, so I actually spent the last week in San Francisco, so I've spent most of the week catching up and reflecting on how far behind we seem to be in the UK in a bunch of areas. So
No, don't say that. Blimey. No, fair, all fair.
The truth hurts. The truth hurts.
The truth hurts.
Yeah.
But yeah,
sure.
it was really great to connect with a bunch of people I've built with in the US before, and the vibe shift there is palpable right now. So I'm really hoping that
How does
becomes
it?
infectious
What's the feeling
for the UK ecosystem as well.
So you mean on the the LFG stuff, build, go for it. Let's make some hay.
I kind of get the sense that definitely hustle culture is making a comeback, which personally I'm very much in favor of. But also
we're going to talk about that later as well.
Right, but also fundamentally there's just a huge air of optimism right now. And I felt immediately on coming back to the UK that the vibe's just palpably different, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of work for us to do here to get that same sense of momentum that the guys over in the US seem to be riding right now.
Interesting. Yeah, I want to dig into more of that later. Andrew, what's cooking with you?
Had a busy week. We've got 2 new partners joining the firm, but I can't tell you who yet.
Bloody hell. You're always the master of mystery. You always say these things, I cannot say. These aren't the droids you're looking for. Okay.
You'll know soon enough.
What's the timing?
They start on Monday.
Oh, blimey. Okay. All right. Well, I'll watch out for the TechCrunch announcements. Mads, you've been busy. You've been in the Far East, and what's been on your mind this week?
Yeah, I had a great trip to Singapore. I think the big news of the week was, again, all AI related. We had Anthropic 3.7 come out, which is very excited about. We had ChatGPT's new model, OpenAI's new model, GPT 4.5 coming out. We'll double back and talk more about them in a minute, I'm sure. Kind of a bit surprised yesterday by what happened. I don't know if you saw in the White House the press conference with
at time of recording. Yeah, just to clarify, at time of recording, all of the White House stuff has just happened. Sorry, Mads, please continue.
Yeah, obviously, and we're all trying to pass the fallout. I saw the full the full press of this morning, and it's just a train wreck. I'm just surprised about quite how this could come to pass. We'll see what the longer term fallout is. This is not pretty, I think, or good for anybody that has the West or Europe's interests at heart. But we'll find a silver lining somewhere, I'm sure. On happier news, it was Celestial Parade week this week.
Celestial Parade, the alignment of the planets.
I was out stargazing with the girls last night, and it was so excited. We spotted Jupiter and we spotted Mars, and I think they were just kind of seeing it with the naked eye was a big thing.
Nice. Well, I saw not as glorious as a Celestial Parade, but I had a bit of a kind of a choke moment yesterday when I saw that Skype is being closed. So Microsoft are closing Skype on May 5th. Well, yeah, sure, and it was kind of yeah.
Except the problem is now we get, instead, if you're so lucky, you get Teams, which is even worse.
But don't you? I
All
remember,
good products go to Microsoft today.
They do. They do. Well, actually, do you know what? The one that didn't was the Outlook app. They bought. I can't remember the name of the product, but they bought this incredible iOS email app. It must have been best part of 8 years ago now. So there are a few little gems that come through, but most I'm totally with you, Karin. But I saw that and I thought it just took me back to kind of the early days of like the boom of tech. I think it was 2003, 4, and it was like, anyway, I had a little moment, and this week for whatever reason, I've been working with 4 purely female-founded teams this week, and that's really unusual because Mads and I invest in industrial, so it tends to be very kind of back-officey industry construction where there don't tend to be that many women coming through. And for whatever reason, it was four pure, not mixed teams, but all female-founded teams, and that was a really interesting insight. We were talking, we were shooting the shit about how men behave in pitches and the gender gaps, and it was a really enlightening week. I think it's possibly a pod on its own, but lots to ponder on how the industry is morphing and changing with regards to gender. I know DEI is not very sexy at the moment, but there's possibly some more stuff to dig into there at some point. So
I have opinions.
Let's kick off. Go, Karin. Let's go now. Do it.
Yeah. So I saw your notes ahead of the show, and I think there's kind of this DEI mantra that's been prevailing in tech per se, but especially here in Europe, where I think we've kind of been infantilizing women and minorities, expecting the market to adapt to us rather than us accepting that there's a game and that we need to play that game. So that's kind of my broader take on this, that I don't think anybody should adapt for women, right? Like, I think that women need to learn to play the game.
Interesting.
Do you want to dig into this now? I have opinions, or should we park it, Dan?
No.
Your call.
Well, no, Andrew, go. What? Go.
So I agree with you, Karin, but I'll caveat that many would say that the reason why women have to adapt is because it's been a male-dominated arena for so long that the way in which business works, which is it's a sort of battlefield of ego and it's a fight, rather than, the behaviors and the traits are representative of the male condition rather than some of the more positive female conditions. Well, I'm just saying this is the counter argument, right? I would argue actually that business is a fight, and so I don't know how you escape from that. I don't know how you sort of, and for me, it all feeds into the sort of wave of millennial ethos around even management. I've had friends close to me who are younger, who have been in startups, who've told me that the management styles of old have gone, and you have to be soft, you have more soft with people, and like sort of this sort of walking on eggshells approach of, if you're going to tell someone off, you've got to wrap it in cotton wool and say, well, I'm terribly sorry to mention this, and I'm sorry I hope it doesn't hurt your feelings, but actually you really should have got that done by Friday. Sorry, rather than where the F is the thing you said you would get done. And I think it's part of this whole debate around actually how people operate in business. And I think, trade for me is at a macro level is a replacement for invading another country. Essentially, like the human condition of ownership and wanting to win, we've replaced running over the border and killing each other and grabbing land with money and trade. It's ugly to admit, and so it's unsurprising that business is cutthroat, and therefore that trickles all the way down into management, where you can't spend your entire life wrapping people in cotton wool and apologizing. And as Jordan Peterson would say, he says, how does he describe? He describes women as more reasonable and men as less reasonable. And I think a lot of it stems from that. So I think
I think fundamentally,
I was going to say, it sounds like you're agreeing.
I think fundamentally, to be a great founder, you have to be kind of disagreeable, right? So we shouldn't be pandering, and creating an environment where everything is softly and everyone agrees. I also just find that quite condescending, right? Like as a woman, I find that condescending that there's this kind of assumption that women aren't disagreeable and that we are fundamentally like different. I think not all men are good at selling and operating and leading either. And the reality is that there is a pipeline of people who can and can't succeed in this game, right? Whether they're men or women. And the pipeline for women is smaller because fewer women do STEM, number one. And it's also a path that just doesn't appeal to women in the same or to the same extent as it does to men. So yeah, that's my high level take on this.
I totally agree with you. I think there is. Well, let me reframe a different question for you, Karin. Do you think that in the future we will see less aggression, or there will be a frame of nicer business? Or do you think it will always be kind of this very testosterone driven, cutthroat, kill what you eat, dog eat dog? Or is that just how business is done? Or do you think there is going to be a more empathetic, caring, nurturing frame of business in the future?
I think business is about winning, and therefore that is how it should be done, right? It's the same with sport, to take an analogous example, right? Like we wouldn't tell female athletes to be less aggressive or to tone down their competitiveness. I see the archetype of person that goes to build a company and who puts themselves through the grind of doing that as being somebody who fundamentally wants to win, and therefore from a mentality perspective quite similar to the type of archetype that goes into sport. So I think they're very similar and we should have similar expectations.
No, I think that's fair. I think the one thing that came out of the meeting, because these women were much more A-type, they were brutal. I mean, they were just whip smart and wanted to bite my face off. And one thing that came out was a slightly different kind of tenacity, almost like an understated tenacity. Maybe not as rah as the men, but they were going to grind and do it, and they didn't really care about. So I don't know. Maybe there's nuance in this that I think is a whole podcast in itself. But anyway, interesting opening debate. Thank you for that. Starting at the top of the docket, there was a kind of a bit of a initiative this week from the BuyEuropeanMade.eu bunch, suggesting that it's time to buy European. So this obviously is some kind of reflex action to Trumpism and isolationism and protectionism and nationalism and all those good things. So what they're saying is basically it's time to buy European products and avoid American products. And they've created a list of like-for-like products on a grid that I'll share in the comments, but it included cars, social media, streaming services. From the USA side of the list, it suggested avoiding some of the startups that were actually started in Europe, like Booking.com, Netherlands, Gant was Swedish, Marabou was Swedish, Freya was from Norway. And some of the founders on the American side were actually born in Taiwan. One of the founders of Garmin, for example, one of the founders from WhatsApp was born in Ukraine. And there was Fanta on the American side, which was actually came out of Nazi Germany, although it's now considered a Coca-Cola product. So it's a bit weird looking at this blurry mix where they're going America on this side, European products and services on the other side, but there's a bit of a blur in the middle. But the question for the room is, does this hold any weight? Should we forego American products and just buy European? Mads, do you want to kick this off?
I think the objective is noble. I mean, just giving people the benefit of the doubt here. Clearly, if we all want Europe to do better, be better, and so there's this sense of, well, can we just pick some European products to support European business, and it's going to be good for everybody. But I must admit, the approach made me die a little bit inside. I mean, sure, pick BMWs over Fords any day, but should we really stop using US tech? And does that mean we should tell the Americans to stop using Spotify on the other hand and force them to use Apple Music instead? I mean, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, sort of thing. So surely this kind of protectionist approach is the road to mediocrity. And I think we should set ourselves the objective to make the best products in the world in the categories where we choose to compete, as opposed to sort of some weird, let's go and pick number 3, 4, 5, or 6, second, third, fifth best, you know, and hope that things will be okay. I would like to see us be much more ambitious than the approach that was suggested here.
The chap that suggested it to me, his caveat was, look at the list, and isn't it incredible how weak the European counterparts are? I was like, yeah, okay. Andrew, should we buy European?
I sort of like the idea. I mean, for a long time, if you think about what it's trying to do, which is promote, you know, Europeanism, you could equally have a website that said "Buy British," right?
Are you old enough to remember Buy British? Do you remember,
Well, I think for a long time, nationalism or perhaps patriotism has been very unfashionable, which is to promote, you know, to promote your country first has almost been perceived or interpreted as racist or xenophobic to others, and that's always really frustrated me, because a nation state, or even the European bloc, is ultimately just a group of people who share common culture and traditions and have a shared history and broadly share a vision of how to live. And if you don't support and defend that, it's inevitable that it gets changed or usurped by outside influences. So I think it's a great idea, actually. The problem, to Matt's point, is that a lot of the products need to be as good, and a lot of them are not. We've had and this is something Karin can speak to, is, you know, why are European and British products never quite as good? Like when I was running a startup, trying to hire a great product manager was so hard. So love the idea, but you do need products to be as good or better than the competition.
Karin?
Yeah, I agree with Andrew on the patriotism and nationalism front, right? Like I believe strongly in supporting your own country, and that's why I like to buy British produce, right? It's something I can directly do to support British farmers, but that's because British produce is actually really damn good. And I think, to Andrew's point, the real problem here is that, especially on the tech front, obviously we can talk about cars and stuff like that separately, but on the tech front, for the most part, European platforms and products that have emerged over the last couple of decades just aren't on par with their US counterparts. And I just believe that the cream always rises to the top. So instead of this kind of COPE initiative to buy inferior products just because they're European, I think what we should be doing is getting into why Europe hasn't produced these category leaders. I think Spotify is a great example of one that genuinely is. It's a great company, but why don't we have more of those? And ultimately, the best way to get Europeans to use European tech products is to create an environment where we can build them. And right now, for a number of reasons, that just isn't happening. And I kind of fear that the trend right now and a lot of the stuff that's going on within the EU around AI is going to leave us even further behind, because all products are going to be AI enabled to a greater or lesser extent. And I think all this focus on AI safety is precisely the reason why we're not going to be building those category defining AI enabled companies.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, let's dig into a little bit of the Europe story. So this week, Stripe's annual letter was released. And it's brilliantly written. I will post this in the comments. It's almost like a shareholder or a State of the Union or a shareholder kind of release. Lots to digest around the state of AI, fraud, stable coins, because obviously, Stripe the payments platform, so they'll be coming very much from the kind of the financial side. Let's talk about stable coins and other really interesting insights. But there was a section focusing on Europe because I think they're Irish Bay. I think they still cross the pond, if memory serves me. And they cite Draghi's EU report around the drop in productivity compared to the US. And they talk about their experience setting up a company in Germany over a company in the US, and the German company took 3 months compared to 3 days in the US, opening bank accounts and getting things up and running. So a few quotes just to tee up the conversation before we crack on. And one being, Europe needs a broader, deeper, and more diverse array of financial solutions. In the US, almost 80% of corporate lending is now from non-bank sources compared to 32% in the EU. So this raises the cost of capital for European firms, which in turn lowers investment rates. Founders in Europe are twice as likely to see North America as an opportunity for growth than Europe itself. And GDPR alone is estimated to have reduced profits for small tech firms in Europe by up to 12%. So, Karin, coming into your kind of regulatory and your AI safety comments. So, with the Euro parts in mind, what are your reflection on John and Patrick's letter? And Mads, do you want to kick this off?
Yes, absolutely. So in terms of the letter, I thought it was wonderful to see and to read. I think overall there's probably not much we haven't covered before, but it was just so great to see the Collisons put focus on it. You know, they're sort of a little bit of sort of the lost sheep or the lost children, right? That left Europe to go to the US to set up this incredible company that Stripe is. Some of the things they call out, as you say, some of the unhelpful policies around tech. Karin mentioned the AI regulation, but also the fact that the venture capital ecosystem still is underdeveloped, that there is much less venture capital available in Europe, especially at the growth stages, and all this kind of excessive regulatory complexity, and also around sort of labor market rules that are limiting and making it harder just to build a company. In terms of solutions, they're calling out also things we've talked about before: capital markets reform, opening up and making it easier for pension funds to invest in venture capital is going to be super important. And then, sort of just a general unified European approach to this. We should act more and more in unison, and this is also something Draghi called out from his report. So I think they're super smart, accomplished entrepreneurs, and they're focusing on things we've talked about, and it's a welcome debate.
Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was incredibly well written. Karin, what were your thoughts?
I mean, aligned with pretty much everything that they called out, and I guess it's not news to most people. I think, the thing that is front of mind for me right now, and something that I can see a bunch of the teams I'm working with really struggling with, is how to get around the increasingly burdensome labor laws. Obviously, we have some new stuff incoming in the UK with the Employment Rights Bill, which the Labour Party are pushing through this year and next. What I'm observing is that it's just getting increasingly difficult for startups to take hiring risk, and particularly the change to giving, or the proposed change, I should say, because I don't think the bill's been passed yet, but particularly the changes that are being proposed to day one rights. I actually really worry that this is going to be another one of those good intentioned policies that ends up hurting both the industry and businesses, but also the very people they're intending to help. So, for instance, there's a lot of emphasis on maternity rights for women, but I fear that in practice, what's actually going to happen here is that founders and early stage companies in particular are going to be very nervous to actually hire women of childbearing age, because they're going to be worried that they're going to go off and have a baby, and they're going to be stuck without the means to replace that person while they're out. So fundamentally, I actually feel sad and kind of perplexed about the fact that the UK hasn't doubled down post-Brexit to really pull away from some of the European wide standards that have been set out here to create the most business friendly and startup friendly environment to build a company in Europe, right? Like, the UK is already on so many levels the best place to do that. We have the language, we have the science sector, we have the universities, we have the talent, we have the relationship with the US, and it's still relatively easy to build a company and to start a company here compared to, say, Germany. You can build a company or start a company within 24 hours on Companies House. You can do all of that online. In Germany, it takes weeks. I think you have to have a minimum amount of cash in the bank. All of these things make the UK a great place to build. And I just despair that we haven't had politicians with the vision to do what's necessary to make the UK a great place to build. And I think this employment rights bill is a great example of regressive policymaking rather than visionary policymaking that allows us to build a thriving tech sector here.
Andrew,
Corinne, I have a forecast here. I think it's going to be watered down substantially. Everything I hear, all the vibes I hear coming out of number 10 is that they are so focused on trying to breathe life back into the economy that I actually think some of the more leftish parts of Labour that have been pushing for this employment rights bill, I think are going to be defanged. I mean, there will be a bill, but I think it will be watered down significantly compared to how bad it could have been. So I think your warning is, your concern is well-founded, but I am hopeful that it won't be quite as bad as some might fear now.
Yeah, I hope so too. But I guess I would make the point that we shouldn't just be watering down more bad policy. We should actively be making policy that makes it easier still for companies to do these things, right? And actually, you know, what I'm observing now is that already startups are very nervous about hiring in the UK, partly because of the uncertainty around this. So, you know, with the emergence of platforms like Deal, it's actually super easy for a UK startup to hire someone in another jurisdiction with very little overhead and setup effort. And I think what we'll see is more of that, right? Like we'll see more people getting hired in other markets where they don't have this kind of regulatory burden. And I also think we'll see more contractors instead of permanent employees. And that's not really good for anyone because those people don't have skin in the game. They're not going to be recycled as future founders by virtue of working as contractors. So yeah, I think there's a lot to unpick here, but it's fundamentally a bad thing.
Andrew, anything to add to this?
Agree with everything that's said. It's immensely frustrating. The UK does remain the best place in Europe and easiest place to run and start a company, but others will catch up. And if the European Union gets its act together with the EU Inc., and that's not hard to create and it's easy to manage and it has the advantages of being cross-country, I don't know how you compete against that. So starting from a position of strength, we're just slowly being eroded because we're making those bad decisions. We're not building on those strengths. We're actually just adding more burden. And it goes back to everything we've talked about on the last 5-10 podcasts, which is government rhetoric, not matching government policy. And it's just, you just really want to ring these, you know, get these people in a room and brainwash them or reprogram them, because it's immensely frustrating that they're just not doing the relatively simple things they could do to help the UK accelerate itself.
It would help if any of them had ever actually built something, of course, but that's probably another episode in its own right.
Yeah, we did discuss a few pods back how everyone in the Labour cabinet, we don't think has ever worked in business or. Yeah, blimey. Well, we're gonna flip this to the positive, and deal room and deal flow. We're a bit report heavy this week, which is great because there's loads of reports out, loads of data to look at. So deal room and deal flow have launched their Accelerating Europe report. So we're going to flip all of that nihilism and negativity into the positivity, although some of the figures don't quite marry to that positivity. But it's a bit of a long and a winding intro, but bear with me. So the Deal Room Deal Flow Accelerating Report is out. It's part 1 of 3. Now, opportunity is the core mantra here. That's what they're that's the force of the document. For context, the US is now twice the size of the EU. It was roughly the same size in 2008, but it's now roughly twice the size with regards to GDP. There are 35,000 startups in Europe, which is now more than anywhere else. Now, interestingly, China had 50,000 born in 2018, but they've now just over 1,000 in 2024. Again, a topic for another podcast, but that's a seismic drop-off. But there is a similar kind of fall-off cliff in Europe. The number of VC-backed startups peaked in 2018, but we're now back at 2010 levels. So there's around 9,000 VC-backed startups in Europe, down from 24,000 at the 2018 peak. And the gap, again, something that we talk about incessantly, but the problem here is the funding gap. And there's around $375 billion worth of funding gap. So we need more cash in the tank. So nearly everyone, I bet, has seen the GDP figures, the EU versus US GDP figures. But if you break it down into purchasing power parity, and if you take out FX, those numbers look the same. And Mads, I'm going to pull you into this chat in a second. But when you look at some of the figures by different vectors, the numbers look the same, EU versus versus the US. But the GDP per hours, this is where the real cliff looks. So GDP per hours worked in the EU is roughly, the UK is now 25 points behind the US. And the other challenging story is that, especially Italy and the UK and Europe, that this growth has just been stagnating. So what I wanted to very quickly do before I open it to the floor was have a look at what GDP is in the US and where it comes from. And over 2/3 of that 30 trillion US GDP is PCE, or personal consumption expenditure, which in lay terms means consumers spending. So, and government, another little anecdote, government consumption is around 5 trillion, around 15%. So I guess the question for the room, and Mads, if you can kick this one off, is the path to growth to get Europe to spend more, to get consumers to spend more? Is that the path to growth? Mads, over to you.
I think in economic terms, there's always sort of a question of animal spirits, animal sentiments, right? If people feel wealthy, they'll spend more money. I think a lot of the money that's been spent in the US might be on credit rather than actual money people have in the bank to spend. I don't know whether we should make kind of the Europeans more profligate spenders and, take out more credit cards and borrow more money to spend more. I'm not sure that's necessarily the very best idea. But I sort of maybe taking it somewhere else. I think to some extent, some of the stuff in the report is stuff we've covered before. I think the report is very nice. I think one of the things that you highlighted, Dan, was that there is this divergence and that a lot of it is down to FX. But at the end of the day, the main difference is still down to productivity. And the UK is 24% below on a purchasing power parity basis. And FX also does matter. It matters when we travel. It matters when we buy things like iPhones and whatever else we want to spend our money on. And I think fundamentally, I'd love us here in Europe to just have a lot more money to spend on things, right? I'd love for us to have a stronger consumer society. So maybe that's back to your point. How do we become more affluent? How do we become wealthier? Well, we need to build more great world-leading companies. We need to build more great tech companies. Some of that it will hinge on structural reform. We've talked about reforming capital markets, making them deeper. We've talked about making it easier for pension funds to invest in ventures so we can get more capital in, which we need. But some of it is also on us, right? As the ecosystem, the founders, the investors, we need to do well and build great companies and compete. Back to Karin's points from earlier, this is not about, kind of trying to think about this wonderful world where everything is just nicer. No, we've got to work hard. We've got to grind. We've got to hustle. We've got to do the things we need to do to win globally. And when we win, we'll create great companies that'll create wealth, that'll give us all more money to spend. And I think that's how I think we need to win this game.
Andrew, should we get Europe to spend more cash?
Yes.
I mean, let's put it in context. I mean, the US deficit, I think, is $32 trillion. A lot of their growth has been mega debt. And their GDP is whatever, 3 trillion, so 10% of their total debt. And I know obviously Doge is in there to try and save some money, and they're looking at other ways to tariff their way to growth. But so back over to you, Andrew. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I stopped talking. My view for a long time has been that we're too hung up on the academic approach to economics over here. I mean, debt's not good for a country and it becomes expensive. But what's far more expensive for a country is lack of growth, because the debt you do have goes up in cost, and it has a compound effect across the entire economy. Because if we're not growing, companies reduce in size, companies don't hire, new companies don't come into your economy to start. So without growth, you're really dead in the water, and it just becomes this perpetuating cycle of decline. So look at what works, and every time there has been the threat of recession or there have been problems in the economy, the US double down and spend money and remove regulation and reduce tax to stimulate growth. Europe and the UK do the opposite. Now let's look at the figures and how both regions, the countries are performing. I don't think it's rocket science. And so we need to cut back on wasted expenditure in government for sure, and not just automatically throw more money at the NHS if it's good after bad without thinking about structuring, restructuring, and all of these things. But fundamentally, without growth in the economy, you're dead in the water. And so the primary decision making, the primary policy making should be around really growth to some extent at all costs. And once you have that, your tax take will go up, and then you can start to think about, okay, great, more people are being employed, more people are at work. The government tax take isn't going down, it's going up. Now, how do we spend that money best, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just not the psychology. The psychology in UK and Europe is of scarcity. And I'm still at a loss how we change that, other than rant on and on and on about it on these podcasts and promote the need for this change until eventually some politicians cotton on and hopefully we vote them in.
Corinne, where would you take this?
I think this is one of those topics that's actually very nuanced depending on which part of Europe you talk about, right? So I'm German originally, so I know that the problems in Germany are very different to the ones we see here in the UK. Germans, for example, have just a culture of not taking out credit, right? Like they're a nation of savers. So that's, I think, a different consumer spending problem to what we see here in the UK, which is that, frankly, like people just don't have any money to spend, right? And that's because their costs have gone up massively. It's incredibly expensive to rent, let alone buy your own home here. Energy bills are through the roof. People just don't have money in their back pocket to spend. And then on the other side, we also have a huge workforce participation issue. And I think in order for us to address that, we have to have some really hard conversations about how to realign the incentives, because I just looked it up, right? Like, so right now in January this year, we had 7.5 million people on universal credit in the UK. Now, those people don't have money in their pockets to spend, and they also don't have incentives to strive while the government keeps subsidizing their income. So I think that, the problems are very different depending on which part of Europe you're talking about, but for sure in the UK, one of the main things we should be doing is figuring out how we get people back to work and how we get them off government support.
My goodness, we were going to get mega political then. I'm going to flip into gear 4 and go Mads, AI Corner. Give us the latest kind of lowdowns, what's been happening on the AI side.
Yeah, I just think that's probably a lot more exciting, to be honest. And it's been a super exciting week. Anthropic released Claude 3.7, Sonnet, and ChatGPT 4.5 has just come out. Sonnet 3.7 is super impressive. I love it. I've always a huge Anthropic fan. GPT 4.5 has sort of been one of the things the industry has been waiting on for a long time. It's been trained using about 10 times the compute of the last iteration, 4.0. And overall, the initial impression is that it might be a bit of a letdown. The conversations feel warmer, perhaps, and more intuitive and emotionally nuanced. Are some of the things that folks are saying, and the question that's being raised is, well, is this really about a next-gen frontier AI, or is this more the sound of a pair of overpriced headphones? Sam Altman, he's acknowledged that it's a giant and expensive model, but he's also said it won't crush the benchmarks. And so if you think about a model like this costing $2, $3, $4, maybe even $500 million to train, the biggest issue here is that it's very, very expensive, and therefore the pricing of it has also been very expensive. about 10 times more than competition. So yeah, I think the question isn't so much whether the Vipes are better or not, but really whether these Vipes can justify burning so much money on improvements that maybe are relatively marginal, which sort of raises a bigger question. Are we at the edge of what the scaling laws can give us? I think one of the vectors here we might want to look at is kind of this notion of AGI we've been talking about. Are we getting closer to AGI? And it seems pretty obvious now that scaling isn't going to lead us to AGI. We're not seeing the returns here on the scaling, but rather we're seeing value somewhere else, which is in what we used to call a wrapper, but which is we can sort of say, look, this is much more than a wrapper. It's all the applications that are being built on top. And so I think to some extent, those of us that have been saying for a while, look, the models are going to commoditize and the value is going to be in the application layer. I think GPT 4.5 really hammered that home, if nothing else.
Sorry,
Something
Franz, go
else,
on.
yeah, sorry. I mean, if you want to go around the horn, I wanted to talk a little bit about Chinese AI and DeepSeek as well.
Yeah, do it.
So the DeepSeek, they announced this week that they would cut pricing by another 75% during off-peak hours to align with US and EU daytime hours.
Love it. Love it.
And so on one hand, you're seeing OpenAI coming out with this incredibly expensive model and DeepSeek going exactly the opposite way. You talked earlier about the reduction in the number of Chinese startups. She has done an absolute 180 on this over the last 2 months. The DeepSeek announcement earlier in the year, and really December 26th, has galvanized the Chinese nation. There is so much talk now about rapid adoption of DeepSeek across China, and she has firmly put the entrepreneurs back in favor again, and sort of swung right behind tech. So, yeah, I would say to all Western tech companies, watch out. The competition is coming.
I love it. It's like, it just reminds me of every time that China gets in a bit of the doldrums, they devalue. And it just reminds me of that. It's like, yeah, we're just going to, that OpenAI mega spend, we're just going to give you a 75% discount. I was like, it sounds so Chinese to me. But Karin, when you're out with founders and you're working on projects and you're out and about in the world, do you play with the latest AI tech? Do you care about this kind of stuff at the cold face?
I mean, I use it in my own work every day. So I'm I guess, super user of ChatGPT, Perplexity, and Claude. But I'm increasingly seeing teams using it as part of just standard operating best practice. But also, every company that I'm working with right now is looking at how to get a 10x improvement on their product experience by implementing AI somewhere in the layer. I was always like super skeptical of all the arguments people were trying to make around AI wrappers being short-lived. I think that ultimately these foundational models are just an enabler for great products, right? And they'll be integrated into different types of applications in different ways to create better experiences at what those products are already good at. And obviously the ones that have the real advantage are the ones who are building with AI in mind from the ground up. And the UK has been great at producing those companies for a number of years now. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, Sergey Brin at Google is trying to push, he's back in the hot seat and he's trying to push the organization into being the leader of AI and pushing for AGI and all these things. And he has basically said to everybody, you need to be back in the office. We've talked about this a bunch of times before. It's no new news, but it was really interesting. He put some numbers and facts around it, and he's saying, I recommend being in the office at least every weekday. 60 hours a week is the sweet spot of productivity. Now, to bring that back into a European perspective, around 3/4 of British firms offer flexible working. B2B is slightly higher. Hardly any mid-sized or large orgs don't offer some kind of flexi work. I think it was 6% the last time I looked. So there, as of August 22, the EU established a comprehensive policy around paternity leave, parental leave, leaning into the conversations we were having before around this slightly more work-life balance suggestion. But obviously in the States, the grind is back. And we talk about work ethic and working hard and, Is the grind back? Should it be back? Andrew, what do you reckon?
Well, I think startups growing very fast tend to be chaotic, and early stage they often lack process, and that can be a benefit because it means you can move very fast, right? It's the key advantage you have that versus a large organization. And the challenge for working remotely is that you actually need quite a lot of process to tie a team together, because you lose the serendipitous interactions and the high cadence of communication, which in person enables. So it's also hard to create a really consistent culture. And with startups, that culture is all about urgency. But I think it's important to separate in person from working 9 to 5. And in other words, flexibility is not incompatible with primarily being in person. You know, having someone sort of clock in and clock out is very different to primarily being in the office, but giving people flexibility when they need to go to the doctors or not clock watching them. And at 7%, you know, we don't clock watch each other and we primarily work remotely. But that in-person time when we do the 1 or 2 days in the office is without question highly productive, and you can sense the difference as you accelerate projects and the things you're working on from doing that. So broadly, I agree. And if I was running a startup, I would want it to be in person. So you're all slaving away at 11 p.m. in the office to hit the deadline.
Okay, so grind is back. What I'm hearing is grind is back, but not for all sizes and stages of business. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's true. Every company has a different ambition level, and if you're saying that, if we agree that being in person in an office provides an advantage over not being in person, and you're trying to win, you're trying to outright win, then you're going to need to do that to beat your competition. But if you're in an industry where actually you're not trying to outright win, and you're happy turning over a modest amount of money, and you're happy not growing fast and not growing as fast as you can, then maybe you can get away with productivity that's lower.
I think that the only thing that I slightly challenge is that sometimes you need to be out of the office to do your job. And I think in our industry, in venture, sometimes you need to squirrel away and do that analysis and write that report and dig into something. And that's not about being, you know, at the water cooler.
And that's why I said
going
it's
out
not
for
about
pizza.
9 to 5. It's really about flexibility. Yeah.
Karin, I know you're bullish on the grind, and having come back from the Bay, you're going to be even more wound up for the grind. But what's your perspective?
Oh man, this is a big topic. So I actually disagree with Andrew on some aspects of what he just said. So
Great.
First of all,
Let's
I
dig
think
in.
I think we're conflating two issues here, right? Like, one is, are people in Europe working hard enough, and should the grind be back? And the answer to that is no. People in Europe across the board generally don't work hard enough, and yes, the grind should absolutely be back. I think the bit that I would challenge is that you definitely don't have to be in person to grind hard, right? Like, I work remotely and I track my hours. I think I average at like 11 to 12 hours a day. So I think from my perspective, and at Levels, we had a fully remote async culture that we built from the ground up. It's ultimately about what works for that company and for that team, right? So if any big tech company or government department that tries to go remote is almost certainly going to fail, because they haven't built that culture from the ground up, and they also haven't hired people with the characteristics and skills to succeed in a remote environment, right? So I always like to think that building companies remotely well is like company building in hard mode, and it's definitely not for everyone. But there are definitely situations where it can be highly effective, and there are a lot of advantages to working like this. So obviously the most obvious one is that you have access to a global talent pool, but also, you know, a lot of parents who are generally the people who tend to be more experienced in whatever role you're hiring for, they can't stay in the office until 11 p.m., right? So what you're essentially saying is you're ruling those people out of coming and working in your early stage team. Whereas if you have those people working remotely, at least for some of the time, then they can put their kids to bed and then get back to their desk and carry on working. So for me, it's not about the location, it's about the type of people that you hire, how well the team knows each other. So Andrew, like at the earlier stages, I completely agree. I think unless the teams work together before, it's very hard to find product market fit and to get through those iteration turns. If you haven't worked together before, you don't know each other well, it's hard to get that alignment from everybody on the team. But I think if you're a team of people who've built together before, especially remotely, then
I agree with that.
Then there are like massive advantages to working that way. And it's, a really deliberate remote culture is actually a forcing function for doing a lot of things really fucking well that every startup should be doing well. And that includes things like having great documentation. It means, everybody is aligned at all times and running in the same direction. So yeah, I think if startups have the right DNA from day one, then I would absolutely encourage them to work remotely, but it's definitely not for everyone. And I think it's extremely hard to successfully implement a remote culture retrospectively.
But the key there was like there were a lot of ifs. So if you've got people who know how to intentionally build that culture and understand how to do that and have worked together before, I completely agree. I mean, I've worked remotely primarily for years. As Andrew Galt, my co-founder, has been West Coast for over the 10 years I've run 7%. So I love working remotely, and I'm a self-starter, and I'll be at my desk for a stupid number of hours or out and about or whatever. But too often I see early stage companies with more inexperienced founders who they're on such a steep learning curve just to build their startup that some of the nuance around being intentional about and the challenges and the gotchas of a remote team, they never even get to because they're too busy learning steeply about even how to hire the right team, let alone the sort of second or third order issues around, well, the difference between an in-person team or a remote team and the difference between managing a person remotely or in person. So that was my sort of my default as a broad brush, but if you can counteract all the ifs that you've said and you've got those, great. But I think the number of companies that do that successfully,
not for everyone, right? But like
the number of companies that do it are a few.
Right, but the thing is, I think this is often turns into like this reductive argument where it's either remote good or remote bad, and the answer is it depends, right?
Yeah.
So let me turn the question around. You mentioned Levels. Would Levels be an even more successful company if it wasn't remote?
No.
Interesting.
Mads, I think everyone who's ever listened to this pod knows yours and my position on this, but we're kind of conflating two things here. One is this whole remote work piece and Sergey Brin saying get everyone back in the office, and the grind and working hard. So how do you see the world?
Yeah, I think most of the things have been said. Toby Lutke from Shopify has obviously built an incredible company, and they do a lot of remote work today. They have a lot of remote setup. And I think he said very well, they invested incredible amount of resource into making that work. They've made it work, and he would not recommend that for very many other companies. I think the number he's used is something like 10 other companies in the world he thinks can do that. And I think he's got it broadly right. Karin, I think you make all the right points. I think your caveat is delightful. What I worry a bit about sometimes is folks then hearing it and thinking, okay, it's not for everybody, but it's probably for me. And I would say it's probably not for you.
I agree.
Because it's such a small proportion of companies in the world that this is right for. If like Andrew, if like us, you run a venture capital firm and you're never going to be more than 5, 6, 7, 8 people, and you all know each other extremely well, and you don't have to onboard lots of juniors,
100%.
It can probably work. If you're building a successful global tech company and you're looking to scale and you need to bring on, fresh young people and teach them, I think it's a disaster. And so I think for most founders that are looking to build a global tech business, this will be absolutely the wrong thing to do. I think Sergey Brin has got it right. I think folks should be in the office to learn from each other, to discuss, to mentor and train the juniors that come in to help build that company culture. And then I think there will be, Karin, to your point, there will be organizations like you that are smaller, made up of more experienced people that aren't necessarily having that hyper growth, that hyper scale, where you can take other freedoms and you can organize yourself in a different way.
I think there are plenty of examples of startups that are hyperscale startups that are fully remote, right? Like Deal, for example, is one of them. GitLab is a public company that's fully remote. Linear is another one that's doing incredibly well and building exclusively remotely. And I think I'd also push back on the idea that you can't develop junior people remotely. I think the opposite is actually true, because you end up resorting to writing really good memos, to using Loom as a async communication tool. So there are actually opportunities for lots of learning to happen and for it to persist in a way that it doesn't in an in-person meeting, right? But look, I'm not suggesting this is the right path for everybody, for sure. And I think, you know, whatever challenges a founding team is likely to face will be compounded by the remote nature of their working if they're not an experienced team. So, you know, probably it's better for second-time founders or repeat founders to work in this way, because it is, as I said, building companies in hard mode. I'm not denying that, but there's definitely a huge upside for the companies that nail it.
I read that about up to 10% of, I think up to 10% of unicorns are fully remote, which is actually higher than I thought it would be.
Yeah, and don't forget that there's like a lagging indicator there, right? Like, so we're still going to see those companies, and I think like it's definitely not for everyone. But there are a lot of companies that know how to do it and know how to do it well. And I also think the more that we have those examples, the more that playbook will be available for other teams to follow.
With COVID accelerating that remote work kind of dialogue, those businesses are still working out that playbook. So the next generation of unicorns from that period of time is yet to come. But I want to shift gears. I want to talk about the future of AI. It's another report from Google, but it's not actually from Google. It's opinions curated from world-leading investors and founders such as David Friedberg, Elad Gil, Joey Chen, Chamath, Jennifer Lee, and the like. And it's a report. It's called The Future of AI: Perspectives for Startups, and it's focused on founders and how they should think of AI in 2025 and beyond. A quick takeaway, or a few quick takeaways before I open it to the floor. Most people seem to be musing that AI will augment human productivity and creativity, not replace. Not sure I totally agree with that. Reliability and privacy and security tended to be the biggest fears, generally speaking. Yep, we kind of talk about this a lot. It's kind of vanilla. One thing I did agree with, which I'd like to discuss with the room, is the enterprise or the larger org adoption of AI, and will big business get there in 2025? How, where, or what will transform first? So now we're out of the kind of the frontier model stuff, and we're out of the kind of the noise of the media. How is this going to apply in big business? And Mads, can you kick this one off for us?
Yeah, as you said, I think it's an interesting report. I think there's some good takeaways there. One of the things that was discussed, I think, was Dylan Fox, who sort of said, look, enterprise AI adoption is going to be slower than people think because there's so many last mile issues that have to be fixed, and they're not obvious until you're much deeper into the implementation. Elad Gil, he also sort of touches a little bit on that when he says, AI is not overhyped, it's massively underhyped. Just because in terms of the level of maturity of adoption of where we are, we're not nearly as far as many people think. If you look at classical machine learning, actually he says that is only now getting into the kind of the point where that's becoming mainstream adoption, and generative AI is still very early in its infancy. So I think to your question, Dan, I think it's obvious to anybody that's been working with these tools that it will massively transform business and how we do, how we make, how we sell. And perhaps there's nowhere where that opportunity is bigger than an enterprise. So much work in enterprise today is kind of reformulating information, right? You get massive layers of middle management that are taking information in one format and repurposing it in reports and meetings to other layers of the management chain. And we know how much of that can be done with generative AI. So massive opportunity, but it might take a little bit of time until it's fully implemented, just because of the complexity of getting there.
Andrew, what are you seeing in your portcos and how they're working with businesses? Anything to highlight here?
I guess there's a big variety of how people are prioritizing AI within their startups and how they use it. Broadly speaking, I agree with Elad that we're just at the start of this revolution, and I think this generation of AI is a bit like the move to digital or the move to computers. Those who didn't start using computers within their companies will fall behind because the productivity increase is so big by using AI. Equally, I'm still unconvinced that we'll see general AI, so true artificial intelligence, come from the existing AI stack and technology. I don't understand how a LLM and transformer model in the existing sort of realm of the current technology becomes truly self-aware in a sort of scary way. So I think we're still a longer away from that than people think. But for sure, without leveraging AI now, if you're not getting on that bandwagon, you're rapidly going to pay the price. You're perhaps greater in efficiency, perhaps more staff, which means from an early stage startup point of view, your bill's going to be higher, which means your burn's higher, which is a bad thing. But also just generally for the economy, small businesses that don't get their heads around AI today, in the same way that for many years when I started life back in my teens doing IT consultancy, lots of businesses had not got their heads around computers, and you see them struggle and their revenues start to fall and their customer base start to fall and some of the competitors start to leapfrog them, and they don't really understand why. And it's because they've got their heads in the sand, because they're laggard consumers of new technologies and services. So absolutely vital to educate. There's a wider education piece for companies in the economy, not just for startups, around how to start leveraging AI.
I don't think anyone would deny the fact that it is this generation's cloud moment or mobile moment. But Karin, what are you seeing with the teams and the founders that you're working with their customers? Any kind of stories or anecdotes around how your team's customers are behaving and what they're actually doing in the real world?
So actually, most of the teams I'm working with are B2C right now. So that's probably like a little bit less relevant, because they mostly don't know they're interacting with AI if they are, right? Like the consumer, that's often abstracted from the consumer. But just, thinking about adoption of AI in the enterprise, I think that was kind of the initial point we were riffing off here. I can kind of draw on my experience of working with the insurance sector, right? So when I started Lenny in 2016, I was pretty horrified to see how huge legacy financial services companies like insurers and banks are sort of treating and handling their data. And I think one massive barrier to adoption in the enterprise, other than the obvious trust and GDPR issues that we already kind of touched on earlier, is that fundamentally they're running off very legacy systems and their data exists in silos, right? So in order for them to actually leverage the capabilities of AI, I think that foundational sort of infrastructure issue has to be addressed first. And that is no easy feat. And as Andrew will probably know from doing IT consulting work, these transformation projects take absolute years. So in terms of, really fundamental hardcore adoption of AI, right now, for sure in Europe, I don't see enterprise organizations doing much more than paying lip service and tinkering around the edges. So for instance, use cases where the risk is pretty low, like in call centers, sort of giving call handlers the ability to be more efficient by giving them some kind of co-pilot. I think that's the kind of use case that we will see emerging pretty quickly at the enterprise layer. But when it comes to like the really foundational transformational stuff, I think it's going to take a lot longer than people think, especially in Europe, for those companies to figure out how to leverage the capabilities that we have today, let alone what future iterations are going to bring.
Yeah, I want to talk about AI in our industry, so AI in venture capital. Lawrence Lundy Bryan, love that name, from Luna VC wrote a piece this week stating that data-driven VC is over. Now, who doesn't love a brick of a headline? His thesis being that all funders will be able to see all founders because of data AI. Going even further to suggest that this will drive VCs to be super irrational to win because everybody will see every deal. Now, there's a lot of extrapolation here. Now, only this week, Andrew and a bunch of our kind of crew behind the scenes were talking about the AI tools that are available to our industry to source deals. And I do believe that Lawrence is right in many of the aspects, and it's a really interesting thought experiment. But very soon, I do believe that there'll be all access for all people. No founder will be left untouched. Even the ones that haven't even thought about starting a business will be approached by a VC going, "Are you thinking about starting a startup?"
That's
Which is
happening
great
already.
for founders. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've got the tools, and Mads has been stitching together some incredible deal sourcing tools. So there is an argument. I would argue there is an argument that says that data-driven VC has only just begun, but I'm going to open to this room in a second. But either way, I do believe that unless you're an established tier one VC, building an irrationally strong brand and taking a really strong position in a very specific niche will be super important for the non-tier one VCs now that the industry is bifurcated. So I also believe that possibly you could, take such a unique niche that you do lots of other things behind the scenes, but you absolutely take this super, super powerful position. But opening to the room, Mads, if you can kick off, what's now for VC, do you think, with regards to all of these tools?
I think right now where we are is sort of, it's the difference between kind of being a good seed investor or a good Series B investor. Staronsky from Revolut, he built a kind of a set of algorithms where he had a team test, lots of different factors to see, can you identify startups that are good for investment? And the assessment they had on backtesting was, look, we can use algos to outperform 95% of other VCs and firm selection. But that's a Series B and assumes you can get into the deals. And I think that speaks exactly to the point you're making, which is, look, even if you use algos, you need a super strong brand because it's not enough to identify the founders. You also need to convince them to take your money. And that's back to brand, and that's back to support, and that's back to the things you can do for them. And then there's the whole question of, okay, well, Series B is not seed. That's not where it starts. And I think at seed, you have very little meaningful data other than maybe some founders' CVs and maybe a bit of industry research. Now, the industry research commoditizes. Like, and what you can do today using things like deep research are incredible. So in the end, it's all about EQ. It's all about understanding, do the founders in front of you have what it takes to build something truly exceptional in the space they're operating in? And I don't think we've found algos that can quite tell us that just yet, even if we have some signals.
Andrew, what are you using? Do you believe that data-driven VC is over? What's your take on this?
We've tried a few different platforms with limited success, to be honest. I think democratization of data often means commoditization. And so I've always been suspicious of pure play data-driven deal making in VC. VC is an outliers game. In other words, I need to invest in the startups, the very few startups, which will be a huge win. And they come in all shapes and sizes. And sometimes actually the counterintuitive decision, which goes against the data, will be the best decision. So I think data can help with filtering in, maybe like identifying people who say they've started a stealth startup, so top of funnel stuff, and help filtering out, so perhaps market analysis data. But the human factor remains ultimately early stage investing anyway, the critical factor. And so a blended approach is most likely going to be used for most firms going forward. And I think that's what we do today at 7%. Because the number one thing I've learned in 10 years of investing is it's just so much about the founders. And to Mad's point, market data is not going to help you much with that. We've experimented a few times actually with psychometric testing, sort of opt-in from a founder point of view, especially when there's more than one founder. If they haven't done it, we've said, look, we're really curious as to the dynamics in your team, and maybe it'll help you guys or girls. And the handful of times we've done it, everyone said yes, and they've been curious. And actually, maybe in itself, that would be a really great filter, because if someone says, no, I don't want to do it, then that probably says something about themselves.
But that might,
and we've actually, to be fair, we've done it ourselves and team, and we've always coughed up our report and gone, here you go, you can look at my report, and now you show me yours.
Will you carry on doing psychometrics, or is it not worth it?
We dropped off. We felt that it was a slightly odd thing to force founders to do, but definitely with a new fund, I mean, we'll sort of sit down. Okay, what's worked, what hasn't, what should we try experimenting with? And I think it is a really interesting thing for founders themselves to do, especially when they're thinking about hiring the next key people into their team, how to complement their own temperament, or perhaps how they need to balance out the human factor.
Karin, as an outsider, obviously you get to see, touch, and obviously smell people.
I'm
like
on the
us
receiving
quite
end
frequently.
of your data initiatives, so I can offer that perspective, I guess.
Yeah, do please go.
Okay, so I like a meta observation is that bad investors reach out on LinkedIn, good investors DM on X. So that's a very high level thought. I think what I've noticed over the last year is, since I maybe longer than a year actually, but I think since I kind of made a pact with myself to be my absolute authentic self, and to not sugarcoat anything I say, to not sort of get trapped in this cycle of having my speech curtailed, or trying to filter my thoughts to adhere to whatever the current thing or the prevailing narrative is. I've actually had a lot of inbound from VC on X, because I think, I always have to laugh, because I think investors fundamentally say they want outliers and people who think differently, but in reality, they often don't follow through with that. And the best investors actually look for that signal, and they'll try to build a relationship really early. And that's something that I've observed for sure in the last 12 months, that a lot of outreach actually happens on X rather than on LinkedIn. And what you tend to see on LinkedIn is associates, doing, as Andrew said, stealth startup style research, and coming at people with boilerplate, which immediately leaves you with a sort of rookie taste in your mouth. So in my mind, investing at the earlier stages is all about relationship building, and that works both ways. And I think often investors think they hold all the cards, and it really isn't the case anymore, especially as more European founders can raise money in the US. And my next round of investors that I'll be choosing for my next company, I want them to be values aligned. It's not about the valuation. It's not about the brand of the fund. It's actually fundamentally, do we share the same beliefs? Are we aligned on our vision for where we want to take the company? And I think that's a lot more important than what VCs often talk about as sort of being brand. Like, what does that actually mean, right? Ultimately, the brand is the quality of the partners. So.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for that. I nearly didn't bring you in on the topic, not being in VC, but actually that's a really lovely insight. And talking about loving, I want to talk about the deal of the week, and how can we not talk about Lovable? It's the fastest growing European startup ever. Started in Sweden in 2023, about 18 months old. I think they closed $10 million in ARR in about 2 months. They're now doing 17 million. They've got 30,000 paying customers, and they're delivering 25,000 apps per day. They're the automating app builder, the kind of the one-click app builder. So I don't know if anyone has any reflections or thought on that, but I love that as a European success story. And they've just raised 14 million pre-Series A, whatever a pre-Series A is. But Andrew, have you got any thoughts on Lovable?
Well, how great it is to have a good success, and I think we're going to see a bunch of these. So I don't think they're out of the woods in terms of winning. There's a market timing issue around as this technology develops. So that the initial winners aren't always the ultimate winners. But it's a great start.
Yeah, loving it. Mads, any thoughts on Lovable?
Loving it. It's great.
Loving it. I'm loving it. And Karin, anything from you on Lovable?
Haven't used it, but it looks like a great product. And obviously great to see something like this coming out of Europe for a change. So very excited about that.
I love it. I love it.
I'll also add something else actually on this is that I think they've been great at marketing and the
founder-led
messaging
marketing
and the hype around it. Because you said, the fastest growing, startup in Europe. And I was like, well, yeah, by what measure? I mean, lies, damn lies, and statistics. But it doesn't really matter. They're playing the game, and I think that's so important. And it's something that the Americans are so good at. That if it was the one thing European founders, especially on the deep tech side, but actually across the board, could be better at, it's marketing and messaging and getting that right.
Andrew, they did $10 million in 2 months. I mean, that is rocket fuel stuff. I'm with you. I'm with
sure,
you.
But you could have a B2B startup that lands one contract. I mean, Universal Quantum. What Universal Quantum in our portfolio did one contract of 67 million. So was that in 1 month?
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I'm supportive. I'm saying rinse it. Rinse the PR. That's what you need to do. Play the game.
Sorry, Karin. We cut you off there. What was that?
No, I was just going to say, growth, top line growth is one thing, but it's meaningless without knowing what their retention numbers are. So
leaky buckets, baby. Nobody loves
Unit
leaky
economics.
Buckets. Awesome stuff. Thank you so much, team. Mads, what's happening for you this week?
Lots. I've been on the road for 2 weeks. I'm back in London. We're going to meet some founders. We're going to do some workshops. We're going to try and help great entrepreneurs build good companies. That's what it's all about.
Build, baby, build. Not drill, baby, drill. Karin, what are you up to this week? Any plans?
I'm looking at my diary and wondering what I can openly say. But yeah, so I'm.
You sound like Andrew now. Everything's in stealth.
Well, confidentiality. So this week I'm going to help one of the teams I'm working with launch a substantial new content initiative. So I'm super excited about that, and also helping them onboard some really awesome new members of the team.
Awesome stuff. Andy Rue?
Well, I've got my first week with my new team. I've known both people over 10 years, actually. So
I was going to say, are you going to be in the office? Are you going to be remote?
I am going to be in the office for at least half the week, yes. So I'm very excited because I've known both people for over 10 years. And that makes the whole process of working together a lot easier in many ways. You know each other's quirks and foibles.
Do we know them?
And then on Friday, talking at a defence conference in Cardiff, sunny Cardiff, hopefully.
A defence conference in Cardiff. Well, there's a one. Thank you so much for your time. That was absolutely awesome, and we'll catch you next week.
Look forward to it.
See you soon. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Have a great week.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.